All right, so today we're going to finish up Chapter 7. Lesson 6 will be the last lesson we learned from Chapter 6. Today we're going to be solving trig equations. Now, when we give our answers, you're going to just need to read the instructions, and you're either going to be asked to solve it over an interval of 0 to 360, meaning they're going to be looking for your answers in degrees, or they're also going to be asking to give your answers in radians. So when we're doing these, you can use either the trig graphs, like the graph of the sine or the cosine, or you could use your unit circle, or you could draw triangles. So for the first one, again, we're solving for x. So we need to get all our x's together and solve for it. So I need to set this equal to 0. So the common mistake that would be made here would be to try to divide both sides by sine x. But if you do that, then you're going to be missing one of the answers. So what we're going to do is we're going to subtract sine x and bring it over to the other side and set our equation equal to 0. So I'm going to move sine x to the left side. Once I do that, my equation equals 0. So now I have sine x tan x minus sine x. And now I can factor out a GCF. So my GCF is sine x. And then what remains is tan x minus 1. Now that it's factored, I set each one of my factors equal to 0. I'll first set this one equal to 0. So sine x equals 0. Then I'll set the tan x minus 1 equal to 0. I need to solve. So the first one's already done for me. The second one, I just need to move the 1 over. And now I have tangent of x equals 1. Now, these types of questions are what you saw back in Chapter 5 and Chapter 6. We're looking for, x is our theta. Okay, so here, or it's our s if we were doing this in radians. So let me go ahead first. I'm going to do it in both radians and degrees to show you. So remember, whenever your trig function equals 0 or undefined, it's coming from these axis points. So I'm looking for a y value because sine is y. So I'm looking to find out an ordered pair that's got a 0 in the y position. So here, 1, 0 and negative 1, 0. These are going to be the two ordered pairs I use. Remember, this one is for 0 and 2 pi. But again, remember your interval has a parentheses around the 2 pi. So I don't include 2 pi or 360 in any of my answers because of the interval notation. So this answer over here, it's going to be 0 and pi if it were in radians. If it were in degrees, remember this is also 0 degrees and 180 degrees. So for the sine part of the problem, it's going to be 0 degrees, x equals, or 180 degrees, or 0 radians, or pi radians. For the tangent, anybody remember what angle gives me tangent of what angle gives me 1? 45. Okay, now for this, we got to do the quadrants. We have to figure out, all students take calculus. I need to figure out 45 is my reference angle. I also have to figure out which quadrant tangent's still positive in, and that's going to be quadrant 3. So again, if you're doing it in degrees, remember in quadrant, this is the reference angle. This one would be 180 minus the reference angle. If it's in degrees, in radians, you would do pi minus the reference angle. For quadrant 3, this would be the 180 plus the reference angle, or pi plus the reference angle. And then in 4, it's the 2 pi minus the reference angle, or 360 minus the reference angle. So since I'm doing them in both, and I'm looking for the answer in quadrant 1 and 3, so for tangent, In radians, I know that the 45 is pi over 4. And then the other, in quadrant 3, the other one that has a denominator of 4 is the 5 pi over 4. Now, if I were doing it in degrees, again, the reference angle is 45. And then 45 plus 180 is the 225. So we're pulling back now all of the things that we did in chapter 5 and chapter 6. Okay, again, you should memorize that the tangent of 45 is 1. Let's try the next one. Everybody good on 1? Let's try 2. Number 2 is actually a trinomial. We need to factor this so we can get our two factors that we need to set equal to 0. So let me set up my two binomials here. So I'll have tangent of x here and tangent of x here, because tan x times tan x is tan x, or tan squared x. And then I have to put in the factors of -2. So I can put 2 and 1. And I know my signs need to be different. So I know the bigger number is positive because that's my middle sign. And now I have my two factors. Again, I set each one equal to 0. So the first one becomes tan x plus 2 equals 0. And then the blue one, tan x minus 1 equals 0. I need to isolate that trig function. So minus 2 over here. So tan x equals -2. And over here, add 1. Here's my 45 again. So the blue one's easy because everybody knows that the tangent of 45 is 1. So again, if it asks for in degrees, again, all students take calculus. Again, tangent's positive here and here. So if it's in degrees, you're going to tell me it's 45. And then the 45 plus 180 is 225. Again, if it's in radians, you'd look at your unit circle, and it's the pi over 4 and the 5 pi over 4. Now, this other one, I can't get this answer from my unit circle. This would actually be a calculator question. So again, remember when you're looking for an angle measure, this is where you're going to do the inverse. So the tan -1, you hit the shift button, and then you'd put in the angle measure. Remember, if you put in a negative angle, you're not going to get quadrant 1 reference angle. So I'm going to key that 2 in as a positive, and I'm going to find my reference angle for this is 1.1. So again, all students take calculus. This time I'm looking where tangent's negative, so it's here and here. So to find my answers for this one, I'm going to do up here pi minus 1.1, and here 2 pi minus 1.1. So my two angles for this one are going to be, when I minus pi minus 1.1, I get 2.04. So I'm going to say 2 for quadrant 2. And this one, when I do this, I get about 5.2. I'll round it. So this would be a calculator type question. Number 3 is a little tricky. Yes?
On the test, do you want us to answer in both degrees and radians?
It'll probably specify. I'm not sure, the test isn't made yet, but it will definitely be clear on how we want the answer. I'm thinking it's going to be one way or another.
Okay.
So again, this was the solving, and then down here we checked the first one. It didn't work, but then the second one did. So final answer is 11 pi over 6. Next example. This one's pretty easy. So for this one, I need to group my x's together. So I'm going to subtract the secant x from both sides. So 2 secant x minus 1 secant x is just 1 secant x plus 1 equals 3. Move the 1 over. secant x equals 2. Again, remember that this is a reciprocal. So what we can do is we're really looking on our unit circle. Reciprocal of secant is cosine. So I'm looking to find where cosine of x equals 1/2. Remember, cosine is the x. And again, all students take calculus. So I know that cosine is going to be positive here and here. So either look for the x to equal 1/2 in those quadrants. You could also do the triangle. And 60, 30, 1, root 3, 2. And try to figure out, is your reference angle 60 or 30? And you can see that it's going to be the 60 because cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse. So it's going to be the 60-degree reference angle. So here, if it's in radians still, the 60 degrees is the pi over 3. And then in quadrant 4, it's the 5 pi over 3. Now, if it said in degrees, I know we haven't done a bunch of these yet, but again, it's 60 degrees. And then remember here, it's 360 minus 60. So the other angle would be 300. So that would be giving your answers both ways. But again, it'll specify on the test. The next one, number 5, is already factored for you. So all you need to do is set each of the factors equal to 0. So cosecant x plus 2 equals 0, and cosecant x minus root 2 equals 0. Solve each one. Cosecant x equals negative 2. Add the root 2. Cosecant x equals root 2. Cosecant is the reciprocal of sine. So I'm really looking for sine, and sine is y. So I'm looking for a y that equals negative 1/2. And over here, root 2 tells me my reference angle is 45. So again, all students take calculus. Same thing over here. All students take calculus. So for the sine to equal positive, it's going to be positive here and here. And then for the sine to be negative, oh, my T didn't come out. It'll be here and here. So again, for the 1/2, you can either figure out what your reference angle is. Is it the 30 or the 60? Or look for a y, that's going to be 1/2, and that's going to be the 30. So in quadrant 2, the one that has a denominator of 6 is 7 pi over 6. And in quadrant 4, it's the 11 pi over 6. That's what x equals. Over here, the 45 degree is my reference angle because it's root 2. So I'm looking for the denominators of 4. So in quadrant 1, it's just the pi over 4. And in quadrant 2, it's the 3 pi over 4. Number 6, I need to factor this trinomial. So I've got 2 cosine x, and then another cosine x here. And then, oh, I gotta move this over first, sorry. Move the 1 over, so it looks like a trinomial. So 2 cosine squared x minus cosine x minus 1 equals 0. So then I'm looking for factors of negative 1. So that's going to be positive 1, negative 1. Because when I FOIL that, it does go back to my trinomial. Now I set each one of them equal to 0. Solve for the cosine x. So move the 1 first. Divide by 2. So cosine x equals negative 1/2. Over here, add the 1. Cosine x equals 1. So again, for this one, all students take calculus. This one's going to come from the axis points. Again, I'm looking to find out which order pair has a 1 in the x spot. That's only this one. So this one's going to be x equals 0. That's my angle measure in degrees and radians. For this one, I need to find out where cosine's negative, and that's going to be quadrants here and here. And I'm looking for an x that's going to be negative half, or I can do the triangle and figure out the reference angle. The reference angle is actually 60. So I'm looking for the denominators of 3. So 2 pi over 3 and 4 pi over 3. If it were in degrees, this would have been 2 pi over 3 is 120 and 4 pi over 3 is 240. Or the 60 plus 180, and then 180 minus 60. We'll give it to you. So that's number 6. Number 7, again, it's already factored for us. Next one. Go back. It's already factored, so set each of the factors equal to 0. So tangent of x minus 1 equals 0. Cosine x minus 1 equals 0. Add the 1. Tan x equals 1. Cosine, add the 1. So again, everybody should memorize that the tangent of 45 is 1. So if it's in degrees, it's 45. And remember, all students take calculus. And again, tangent is positive here and here. So the other one in degrees would be 225. If it's in radians, it's going to be pi over 4 and 5 pi over 4. For the cosine equals 1, again, I'm looking for an x value that is 1. It's this order pair right here. So again, it's 0 degrees and 0 radians. We do not include the 360 and the 2 pi because of our interval notation. It had a parentheses, just like you've been doing on the tests that you've taken. Number 8, I'm going to use an identity on this one. So I'm going to use the sine squared x plus cosine squared x equals 1. I'm going to use that identity. I'm going to solve for sine. And sine squared x equals 1 minus cosine squared x. So in this case, I'm going to replace sine squared with this. Cosine squared x, that side stays the same. Replace the sine squared with 1 minus cosine squared x and keep the plus 1. I now need to group my cosines. So I'm going to add cosine. 1 cosine squared x plus 1 cosine squared x. 2 cosine squared x equals 2, because 1 plus 1 is 2. Divide by 2. Cosine squared x equals 1. I don't want cosine squared. I want just plain old cosine. Square root it. So cosine of x is equal to plus and minus 1. So for this one, comes from the axis. So I'm looking for an x that equals 1 and negative 1. So I can see it's going to be 0 and 180, or 0 and pi. So here my x equals, if it's in radians, it's that. If it's in degrees, it's that. One more example, and we're done. This one's easy also. It's already factored for us. There's 8. Anybody need me to go back to any of the other ones on the slides? Okay, so again, so here, remember we can add parentheses because it's being multiplied. So here I'm just going to set sine squared x equal to 0 and cosine squared x equal to 0. I need to square root both sides. Square root of 0 is just 0. So I get sine of x equals 0 and cosine x equals 0. Again, these are going to come from this thing. So 1 comma 0, 0 comma 1, negative 1, 0, 0, negative 1. So for the sine, this one, I'm looking for the y to be 0. So that's going to be 0 and pi, or 0 degrees, 180 degrees. So for that one, degrees, it's that. And if it's radians, it's that. The other one, it's where x equals 0. So for that one, it's going to be here and here. So this is 90 and 270. Or if you're doing it in radians, it's pi over 2 and 3 pi over 2. Again, just make sure you read to see how the question wants you to leave your answer. So that is solving trig equations. Your homework on this is page 665, and it's 17 through 35 odd. Anybody still need this? Slide. I'm sorry? Number 8. Anybody still need 9? Let me go back to 8. There's the homework page. It's on the last. Homework due tomorrow is this. Tomorrow we are going to review for the quiz. And then Monday is your quiz.